Well, welcome to Overtime, where we take Sunday's message further. And we do this because we hope that it is helpful, that it is applicable, it's encouraging for you, your life, your faith, your family. And if this is helpful to you, make sure you subscribe so you are notified each week when Overtime comes out. And then also, if this really connects, make sure to share it with somebody that you think it could be helpful with. But I'm Jeremy. I'm the content director here at North Point, and I'm sitting here with Buck, our lead pastor. Buck, how you doing?
I'm doing swell, my friend.
Who do you think is going to win the national championship tonight?
Gosh, well, Ohio State surprised me. I thought like Clemson and Trevor Lawrence, I was like, man, they're going to like kill them.
Yeah.
And then Ohio State comes and they were like, wow. So if they're that impressive, I don't know. I think maybe they got a shot.
So everybody listening is going to already know the outcome because this is going to release the next day. So what's your prediction? And we'll see if it's aligned with...
Oh, yeah, I still think Ohio State. They got fresh legs, baby. They only played 7 games.
There's a fire in them, too.
Yeah.
You can just tell there's energy.
Yeah, and Justin Fields, their quarterback.
Yep.
It looks like he really is like, he's intense. Like, he is focused. He's like, I'm going to do this thing. Yep. So, he's got that look. I don't know. Who knows? Yeah, I mean, Nick Saban's, the...
resilient guy.
Yeah.
COVID twice now. And
goodness, yeah. He's resilient.
Back at it again.
Yeah, he's the Yoda of football coaching, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Well, we kicked off a brand new series yesterday called Nothing Else.
Yep.
And we had brainstormed a lot of things going into the new year that we could talk about, but we landed on this idea of nothing else. And I just really quick for listeners who were there yesterday, I need a reminder, or somebody who didn't listen. What is the big idea behind this series that we're doing?
Yeah, it's super simple. Nothing else but Jesus. Like, it's just Jesus, just give me Jesus. Everything else right now feels like so much noise. And not that it's not, we need to talk about other things, but it's like, I just think Jesus is the solution. Jesus, I said this on Sunday. I said, man, Jesus is your way forward, and Jesus is our way forward. I'm more convinced of that than ever. With just everything going on in my life, everything going on in our lives, everything going on in our culture, like, oh my gosh, Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. I think that's more true. Well, it's always been true, but I just think it's so much more true than now. So nothing else but Jesus. Let's just discover who he is.
Yep. Yeah, and it's like the crazier things become, the more relevant that idea and that truth is to our lives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. Well, if you're listening and you haven't watched or listened to part 1, make sure to go back and listen to it because we're going to unpack a couple things from there. But as we think about Jesus, one of the things that you talked about yesterday is this whole word irresistibility. When it comes to the irresistibility of Jesus, can you just unpack that a little bit more? How was Jesus irresistible then, for one, and then how is he irresistible to us today, and why is he relevant to us today?
Yeah, I like the word, and the way I used it on Sunday. I just said, I think the more we think about Jesus, the more Jesus will reveal himself to us. And I think the more familiar we get with Jesus, the more context we get with Jesus, the more discoveries we get with Jesus, the more confusion that we clear up with Jesus, I think all of a sudden it's like, wow, like that irresistible, like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. That's exactly what I feel like I've longed for, I desired. And so, by definition, that's being irresistible. And so, when I think about Jesus in the first century, I think there's some obvious, like, low-hanging fruit ideas, like, hey, he walked on water. That's pretty cool. It's like, wow, fed the 5,000. Wow, healed the sick. It's like there was a supernatural element to Jesus that I think was like, unbelievably irresistible. But I also think, there's so many different things about Jesus in the first century that we could talk about. The thing that hits my mind right now is that he was just so real. He was in a context in the first century to where, the religious leaders of the day, they had, their external look. They were concerned about external things. It's always about, what you're saying, what you're doing, what's happening. You have to have this appearance. You have to say the right religious words. You have to do the right religious ceremonial things, to be right with God. And here Jesus comes, and he's raw, and he's real, and he's the embodiment of grace and truth and life and everything that people longed for, and where he walked into the crowds of people who were radically different from him, and it didn't bother him. But it bothered the religious leaders, and that was so radically different. And I think that began to draw people, and he began to be irresistible because he was honestly the embodiment of what people hope God would be. Like, does God really love me? Jesus was there to say, absolutely. And I talked about that a little bit on Sunday. Does, hey, I've done all these things in my past. Like, is God okay with that? Is there any way forward that I can have peace with God? And Jesus was here to say, I'm the embodiment not only of God's love, but God's amazing grace. Unmerited favor. I look at you, I see all of you, I see all of your choices. And hey, the woman caught in adultery, her sin fully exposed. Jesus, the embodiment of grace, says, I don't condemn you. Like, you want to know what God's like? I don't condemn you. I see all of you. And oh, I love you. And then truth, the embodiment of truth. Now leave your life of sin. Man, it's making life so much more complicated. So gave us clarity on the way forward, but also just this unconditional love and grace he took from a concept of religion that we, like in everyday life, like we hear it and we're like, yeah. But I think what made him so irresistible in the first century is people had all these concepts. People had all this religion. And is this embodiment, everything personified. Now here's what grace looks like. Here's what truth looks like. Here's what love looks like. And I think people were just so darn thirsty for that. And in the first century, they were like, oh my gosh, this is somebody radically different. And, on Sunday I talked about there were massive crowds everywhere we went. And, in part, I think if anybody showed up today and was doing supernatural stuff, defying laws of physics, I think there would be something that would be irresistible about them. And then I think that irresistibleness would lead to, hey, what is it about them? And then when there was such authenticity about Jesus, there was such truth about Jesus, there was such security about Jesus, such meaning about Jesus and purpose, and so many things that our hearts beat and long for were being spoken from Jesus to the crowds. I think that just added to his irresistibleness, and he was like, "Wow," and people, and he called things out, the injustices out in his day, and people appreciated that. They were like, "Yeah, okay, he's going to stand up against the things that we have felt for a long time." So,
yeah, I think when I think about the irresistibility of Jesus today, maybe over the past 2 millennia, like 2,000 years. There have just been so many things that I think have fogged the lens at which we view Jesus, right? People have horrible church experiences. People have a horrible experience on the other side of a Christian. To somebody who's experienced those things, what would you say? How do you get back to seeing Jesus in that irresistible way? Because like you said, like we all want purpose. We all want belonging. We all want unconditional love. And Jesus offers all those things. It just gets blurred in the process of church world and stuff like that. How does somebody get back to the irresistibility of Jesus if they're longing for that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I've quoted this on Sunday before, but just to allude to what you said before, an old preacher named Gypsy Smith says there's 5 gospels. This is the good news about Jesus. There's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Those are letters in the Bible about the life of Jesus. And then there's you. And you perhaps are the only gospel people will read. And the Gospels are all about the life of Jesus. But most people aren't going to read those, and they're going to read your life. And your life is going to speak volumes about who Jesus is. And so because that, and because we look on social media and we see flags that are flying, we see hashtags with the name of Jesus, we see quotes with the name of Jesus attributed to some very, ideological concept that we would totally disagree with, or, perhaps the listeners are totally disagreeing with, it adds all the confusion. And so, yes, I believe there's a lot of confusion about Jesus. And I also think our way forward is through Gypsy's comment. That one of many, but I think one of our ways forward is to go back. Something I say a bunch on Sundays. I'm like, man, just read your Bibles. And I know there's a lot of stigma about the Bible. There's a lot of questions, and those are fair. But one of the values of reading the Bible is you get to go back to the source. Ravi Zacharias is a man he passed away recently, but he has some great things he talks about when it talks about Christianity. And he says you never judge a religion by the abuse of it. You have to go back to the source. And going back to the source gives you such insight to what it's all about. Is it true? Is it not? Is it reliable? Is it tangible? So going back to the source to get clarity on Jesus, I would say, I would highly encourage people to read the letter of Matthew, read the letter of Luke, read the letter of John, read the letter of, read the scriptures. And I think the more we can go back and indulge in, okay, what did Jesus actually do? What did he say? How did he respond? And then ask a bunch of questions. Just be curious with what you're reading. I think those are really pragmatically helpful. I think another thing that just hit my mind is the idea I know this may sound weird, but just invite him. Just go, Jesus, I want to know who you really are. Mm-hmm. So would you reveal to me who you really are?
Yeah.
And I mean, I believe Jesus hears that. And I believe Jesus hears that from a person who is a Jesus follower. And I believe Jesus hears that from a person who's not a Jesus follower. And I think maybe perhaps that's the first step, is go reveal your true self to me. I want to know you. I don't want to know the noise. I want to know you. And then what to do pragmatically perhaps is begin to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the Gospels. Mm-hmm. Begin to read the letter of Galatians Paul wrote, to a group of people who are really struggling with the religious laws. And he's trying to write about here's who Jesus is and the implications of who Jesus is.
Yeah.
And so I would say that's really helpful. And then, be super curious. Ask a lot of people a lot of questions. Say, hey, I read this. What do you think?
Yeah.
Hey, I read this. What do you think? What was Jesus getting at here?
Yeah. I like that, because whether it's somebody listening who's going, man, I've never read those books before, mm-hmm. or somebody listening going, I've read them all 20 times, there's still something that we all take every time we read those books.
100%.
And, anybody whose life is, perfect doesn't need to read them again.
Mm-hmm.
But anybody else other than that, I just started going through the book of Matthew again, and I feel like I'm reading it for the first time. Mm-hmm. You just pick up new things every time, because it is that Jesus was so irresistible, and you read about that when you read the Gospels.
Yeah. And I think life happens. So mm-hmm. it's like 5 years from now, I have a new perspective. Mm-hmm. I've learned things. I have life experience. I've been hurt. I've celebrated. All of those things shape my perspective, shape my disposition, shape my context. So when I go back to something that I read 5 years ago, or even 5 days ago,
right.
A lot can happen in 5 days.
Yeah.
I can read it with a different lens. And so oftentimes, the idea to go, hey, been there, done that. The coolest thing, and I agree with you about the scriptures, is when you read it again, it's like a fresh lens. Mm-hmm. It's like, wow. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons why I also encourage reading the Passion Translation. Big fan of that. And I just think, the Passion Translation brings from, the King James Version with a lot of these and thous and, smites and smotes and all those kind of things, mm-hmm. and brings it to, how would Jesus talk today? How would Peter talk today? How would Paul talk today? Because language has changed so quickly. Mm-hmm. And so it's our best attempt. It's not perfect, but it's the best attempt to go, okay, here's how this sounds today. And reading that could also bring some life to what perhaps you've read in the past or maybe heard from in the past.
Yeah, for sure. Mm-hmm. You mentioned Ravi Zacharias a second ago. I just listened to a podcast a couple weeks ago, but he mentioned something that Jesus did so well that made him irresistible, mm-hmm. and something that we can do to represent Jesus better. He said that whenever we're on the other side of somebody who thinks differently than us, mm-hmm. and perhaps has a question about, Christianity or Jesus or the Bible, that we can not just answer the question, but answer the questioner. Mm-hmm. Meaning we look in the eyes of the person, we understand their context, we can empathize with their story and what's going on, understand they have a story, they believe the things they do for specific reasons, and if we were given the same, cards in our life, we might think that way as well, and it's empathizing and then beginning mm-hmm. to answer the questioner, not just the question, and that's what Jesus did so well.
Well, exactly what you said. Imagine in our culture, in our society, with what we know today. I'm not going to describe it because everybody listening knows exactly what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. And if that was true, mm-hmm. If we simply did what Christ did and we did what love required of us, and we had that curiosity inside of us, hey, those that we disagree with, there's something to that. Mm-hmm. There's a reason why they have the opinion they do. There's a reason why they say the things they do. So I want to go discover that before adding my opinion and my thoughts and why they're wrong. And perhaps if we started to move that way and moved in a direction of radical kind of love, the kind of love Jesus came in the first century and today and offers, which is, I think, irresistible. Perhaps that is one step to many steps of our way forward.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. For sure. And it so clearly ties into our vision of just trying to be for Austin.
Yeah.
For Austin is such a diverse group of people, the city, the people moving here, the people who have lived here for a long time. It's just, mm-hmm. it's insane. And if we're going to make any dent in the city of Austin and one day, see the numbers reversed, 8 out of 10 people growing in their relationship with Christ, we've got to understand what it means to 100%. Look them in the eyes and know the color of their eyes and know their stories and what's going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. If we heard everything that everybody thought or we discovered that and we heard their stories and we heard about their parents and we heard what happened with their father and we heard what happened with that first church experience and we heard what that Christian boyfriend or girlfriend did to them, even though they called themselves a Christian, then if we got a snapshot of that in somebody's life, we would go, oh, okay. Mm-hmm. That makes so much more sense. Mm-hmm. And, I was at the bank like 3 or 4 or 5 days ago with Michael setting up his bank account. So he finally got a bank account.
How old is he?
12.
12.
And so he's like so excited, and he's been saving money because he has to get to a certain amount of money. And then I'm like, okay, we'll go, spend the hour and a half or whatever. It takes a long time, at least where I bank. And so we were talking to the banker, and, he just had moved here 3 years ago from California. And I was like, oh, man, a lot of people from California, Joe Rogan and all this kind of stuff, Elon. And so we were talking about that. And then I was just so curious. I was like, hey, did you grow up in church? Is church a part of your life? Have you found a good church here? And he was like, church really wasn't part of my life. But he said, in high school I was invited, but then, this thing happened. And so today my friends and I, we're just like, I don't know. He's like, I don't really believe all that God stuff, but, I'm open to it. And so getting a context to what happened, why he walked away from church, why he walked away from God, created a bridge to where I was like, hey, it's crazy because we actually created a church called North Point, and our church, the foundation of our church is to create a safe place to ask all the questions you want to ask, to be curious, and to go, hey, what about that experience? Does that really define who Jesus is? Can I ask that? Or what about this passage in the Bible? That doesn't make any sense. In fact, I think that's a contradiction. Can we talk about that? And so we had that conversation. He said, man, that sounds awesome. I'd love to. So I don't know if he'll come, but, Michael and I got to invite him to come to North Point. So we'll see.
Yeah. I think something practical that anybody listening or watching can take away from this piece of our conversation is just like, if you are a Christian, who are those people in your life that perhaps you've been just answering the questions and not so much answering the questioner, that, you haven't taken the time to learn their story and discover why they believe the things, and what could you do today or tomorrow, take them out for coffee, anything like that, and begin to really discover, what has gone on in their life, and begin, I think through doing something like that, we can present Jesus as irresistible as he was.
Exactly.
And we don't get in the way.
Yeah, and this circles back to the whole point. If it's nothing else but Jesus, I think the more we think about him, the more he reveals himself to us. The more he reveals himself to us, the more irresistible he becomes. The more irresistible he becomes, the more we see his radical love. The things we may not want to do, like I don't want to, discover this person's story. I just want to tell him my viewpoint. The more we think about him, the more we feel compelled, the more we feel motivated, the more we feel like doing what love requires of us, even though it's difficult. And so it really is a big deal what we're talking about.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned something else on Sunday morning. You said you had a series of slides, and I'm just going to read them. I wrote them down. It says, you said, Jesus is not your accuser. Jesus is not your prosecutor. Jesus is not your judge. Jesus is your friend and your rescuer. He is a friend of sinners. And I mean, those are radical points to think about and make and apply in our life. And it was so good. One of the things I think we all bump into is it's great to think about, but we have these voices in our head all the time, these competing voices. And so no matter how much I want to wake up in the morning and think about the fact that Jesus is my friend and my rescuer, no matter how badly I want to view myself from a non-judgmental stance, I wake up each day and I view myself from a judgmental stance. You know what I mean? And I think we all wrestle with this. How would you give handles to how do we actually view Jesus or view ourselves the way Jesus views us? And how do we kind of sift through those voices?
Yeah, it's a great question. And for me, about 9 years ago, meeting with my counselor, and she was so helpful, and she gave me something that gave me clarity to begin to kind of deconstruct as to what's behind all of that confusion. And she spoke about these 5 voices, and she said, Buck, there are 5 voices in everybody's life, and we all hear things in our head, and we're all like, hey, where's that come from? Voices of accusation, voices of encouragement, all these kind of things. And so the 5 voices, she said, are the voice of God, the voice of Satan, the voice of the world, the voice of my flesh, and the voice of my soul. And those 5 voices are really important to think through, because when a thought comes your way, when a voice comes your way, and it may be competing with what God has to say about you, one of the greatest questions you can ask is, whose voice is that? Get clarity on that. Whose voice is that? It's one of the reasons why I asked the question at the end of the time. I said, is Jesus more irresistible today than he was yesterday? And if not, why? Like what's getting in the way of that? And I think you should think about Jesus enough and think about that to get to the bottom of what is that voice that's competing with who Jesus really is. So for me, those 5 voices have been really, really helpful as just a grid, as something to help me discern whose voice is that, to answer the question more concretely than abstractly. And be able to go, okay, if it's the voice of my flesh or if it's the voice of this world, well, that's really helpful because that's not the voice of God, or it's the voice of Satan, who's called an accuser, and a deceiver. Then that's not the voice of God. So that's not who I am. And that has been just foundational for me to clear up a lot of the confusion and a lot of the energy I spend believing the wrong voices, and discerning to go, but what's the voice of God? What's the voice of Jesus Christ? Because that's the one true voice. If he's willing to give his son for me, I know his voice is true for me.
Yeah.
So that's been, for me, really helpful and has cleared up a lot of the confusion and helped me actually believe the statements that you just wrote or read.
Yeah. So just to reiterate, so the voice of God obviously is, good voice, want to listen to that voice, want to lean into that voice.
Right, and that's the voice that says, you are my son, you are my daughter, I love you, you have so much worth, you are forgiven, you are not defined by the choices of your past, you are defined by who my son Jesus is. You are righteous through Jesus Christ, like you are wonderfully and fearfully made. I knit you together in your mother's womb. You have purpose and meaning. Like, we could go on and on and on, but that's his voice. And, as Jesus said, hey, and I don't condemn you. Leave your life of sin. Man, it's hurting you. It's confusing. That's also his voice. So, yes, the voice of God.
And then we have a voice of our soul. And that's another one we want to lean into. That's a good voice, right?
Yeah, that's who you were made to be. So I foundationally believe God designed you, and he designed you for a purpose. And I think sometimes we get, our dad's voice gets in there, our mom's voice gets in there, culture's voice gets in there, and we pursue things that aren't really who we are and aren't really the purpose we were made for. So it's being able to discern our soul, like what gives me passion, what excites me, what gives me energy.
How did God wire me?
Yeah, how did God wire me? Because you tap into that is your way forward. That is like where you discover so much purpose and meaning in life.
And then the other 3 of the voices we want to kind of just pay attention to. We want to make sure we're not giving these voices all of the kind of airtime in our mind.
Correct.
And you said the voice of Satan was one, right?
Yeah, and throughout the scriptures, Jesus, I loved how Jesus just called him out. So, do we believe in Satan or not? Yes, I absolutely 100% believe Satan is real. And the reason why is because Jesus believed he's real. And Jesus said he's a liar. He's been a liar from the beginning. He's an accuser. He's a murderer. So these thoughts of, hey, you're worthless. These thoughts of, hey, you're never going to amount to anything. These thoughts of, hey, look at what you've done, like condemnation. Hey, look at what you've done, and because of what you've done, you're never going to be good with God. There's no way that God could cover you white as snow. There's no way that your sin is ever going to be able to meet the grace of God and be forgiven for. You've sinned too much. Like all these accusation voices, all these voices to say you're not enough. Man, that is Satan's heyday. That's his territory. He loves that. And Jesus said that's what he does. So just be forewarned. And then Paul goes on in Ephesians 6 to go, hey, our battle's not against all the things we see around. One of our greatest battles is against Satan. Like he is constantly working and accusing and lying and deceiving and trying to outwit us. And, so yes, that's a real voice.
Yeah, for sure. And then you have the voice of the world. Can you give a couple examples of that one?
Yeah. Hey, money's going to make you happy. There's so many, like the cliches, think of all those things. Hey, if you just, hey, sex is no big deal. It's just physical.
Yeah.
Or whatever it is. It's
or
like
the amount of likes I get on social media.
How many likes really determines your worth. So your value and your worth is tied to likes on, a computer system. So it's like, hey, if you just buy this, if you just get this house, if you just get the grass is greener on the other side. And so all of those voices are so much of the voice of the world to say, this world is your utopia. This is all you get. There is no life after this life. So listen to all the voices of the world and, pursue those things. And that's where happiness is ultimately going to be found. And, that voice is constant. It's a barrage on advertisements. It's a barrage on marketing. It's TV, social media, every day of your life. It's like consume, consume, consume. It'll make you happy. It'll make you happy. Go, 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 go. And it's so deceitful because it does give you a momentary rush, but then you got to chase it and chase it.
Yeah. And then the last voice, you said voice of our flesh. Like what's a couple examples there?
So that's, think of coping. Think of, hey, I just one more drink and I'll be fine. Hey, if I just look at that, I'll be okay. Hey, I want control. If I just get control, everything will be okay.
If I buy these things, it'll be okay. Kind of like just the emotions behind all of our desires.
Yeah. Flesh is more personal. World is more external. So, flesh is more like, hey, here's my coping as a result of what's happened that I'm aware of or not aware of. Man, I really struggle with this. And so it's like daily, it's, sometimes you would say, like Paul says, the very things I don't want to do, I do. And the very things I want to do, I don't do. But it's like this constant battle. And he references that as flesh. It's my flesh is battling my spirit. The spirit is the very spirit of God who says, man, I love you. I'm for you. Pleasure is found in me. Goodness is found in me. Happiness is found in me, ultimately. And then my flesh is constantly going, no, just give in. Hey, it's just, say this, do this, lean in. And so all the coping things to go, man, I want to feel better. So oftentimes the flesh is where we chase those feelings, where we cope.
Yeah, for sure. Those are so helpful. I just wanted you to unpack those a little more because I think those take processing. I mean, to kind of discover what voices are we hearing. And it's such a good question. Whose voice is that? And I would just say for anybody listening or watching, if you're on a run, if you're driving in the car, however you're listening to this, like just pause for a second and maybe stop and just, even pause the podcast and just pull out your phone or write down somewhere that question, whose voice is that? Because there's perhaps something you're listening to or hearing right now that you just need to identify those voices and try to center back on the voice of God and the voice of your soul, who God made you to be, the fact that he loves you.
Yeah, and I would just add one last thing. Imperative to nothing else but Jesus. Just give me Jesus. That's what I'm after. If he really is the way, the life, and the truth, if he really is here to give me life to the full, then we got to go after his voice. And just discerning these 5 voices, asking that one question, whose voice is this, gives us clarity to disempower those voices in our life and empower the very voice of Jesus in our life and go, okay, well, I'm glad I have that like toolbox. I'm glad I have that discernment of those 5 voices because it quiets these and it raises the volume on the voice of Christ, which I think is the most important voice we can listen to.
Yeah. Yeah, and that volume analogy is really good because we allow the volume of these different voices to get into our minds. And if we don't turn up the volume of the voice of God, the voice of Christ, and the only way we do that is coming to church is great. Listening to a podcast is great. But ultimately, spending intentional time with God on a regular basis, that's how you increase the volume of the voice of God in your life. And if you don't do that, it's going to be so hard to bring down the volume of the other voices that are going on around you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, that's really good. The last kind of piece I wanted to unpack, I thought this was a great statement you said. You said you don't have to be good to be Jesus' friend. You just have to be honest.
100%, yeah.
Why is honesty and faith so important?
Yeah, so the thinking behind that was I think there are so many things we long for. I long for rest. Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary, and I will give you rest. Oh, man, I want that. I think we want that. We want that peace. We want purpose. We want a direction forward, like, hey, what's my way forward tomorrow, next week, next month? We want our way forward in our marriage with our kids. What do I do now with my kids? So there are so many things we want to open the door of, if you will, to invite God to participate or God to inform, to give us clarity, to give us the feelings we desire, to give us the experiences we desire. And in my mind, I would say so much of that is contingent on honesty. I think honesty is the door handle to open those doors for God to come on in and do the very things we desire. So just what I was alluding to. And if we're not honest, it's like keeping the door shut, but wanting purpose, keeping the door shut, but I want rest, keeping the door shut, but I want anxiety, but you're not opening the door to God's peace to meet your anxiety, to meet your worry, to meet your concerns, but we want it. And what's preventing that door being opened is us being honest. And so what I mean by honesty, and we were talking about this before the podcast, is an example of this is like you and I met for a long time when you were much, much younger. It's like, 50 years ago probably. Because, you're such an old, wise really sage.
Yep.
You are. There's something inside of you that you're like, wow.
Yep.
But when you and I were meeting and you were a teenager and all that good stuff, one of the things I would say is my counsel to you, Jeremy, is only as good as the information I'm given. Mm-hmm. So if you're not honest with me, if you're not giving me good information, it's really hard for me to help you. It's really hard for me to meet you. It's really hard for me to walk with you or empathize with you and be with you in that moment and help you discern what's your way forward, help you feel like you're not alone. So be honest, be honest, be honest. And there was one thing that
I was not quite honest with.
You weren't quite honest with.
Yep.
And I don't know if it was one, but there's one major thing. And so
that's another podcast.
Yeah, totally another podcast. But there was one, and eventually after I don't know how many weeks, months, years, whatever.
Yeah.
Eventually you were honest with it and you said, okay. And it was like after a sermon I did on vaults.
Yep.
And like empty your vault, like come on, just bring it to the light, where
Yep.
you're gonna get healing. Something like that. And you came, and I think it's like the next week or 2 weeks after, I was like, hey, is there anything that you're not telling me that maybe you should be telling me, or anything you're lying about?
And I was like, all right, Buck, here it is. Lay it all out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the reason I share that is because you open the door. Mm-hmm. And man, I am such a broken man, and there are times I can't meet people, and I so wish I could, and I wish I could pastor them. But in that moment, I was able to meet you.
Yep.
In that moment, I was able to walk with you.
And that's where the growth happened.
Yeah.
I mean, it was tough for sure.
Yeah.
It was like the weird way of like just throwing up what was going on inside of me, like emotionally.
Yeah.
But that's where the growth happened, and you were able to point me in that direction.
Right. Give you insight, give you direction, empathize with you, love you, be in that moment. And I think the same is true with God. To go, God, the truth is I have a drinking problem. Mm-hmm. I've never admitted that. I just thought, hey, it's fun. It's just, taking the edge off. It's no big deal. My wife has reflected this. My kids have reflected this, but I just dismissed their voice. Okay, just strip everything away. Just pause a second. And if you're honest and just went, the truth is, I think alcohol's got me. Because alcohol has a voice, mm-hmm. and it's lured me in. And once you take that step of honesty, with whatever it is, could be money, could be alcohol. Hey, my security's found in my money. That's true. God, I just want to let you know. That is opening the door. It's such an invitation for you to ultimately discover, like, Jesus is okay. It's not going to, like, floor him, and he's not going to go like, oh, my gosh, you did what?
Yeah.
All these accusations.
Yeah.
He's going to walk through that door, and you're going to discover he's going to befriend you.
Yep.
He's going to be your friend. His grace is going to be big enough. His love is going to be big enough. His truth is going to be big enough. And he will walk with you to a way forward for you to actually feel and discover and experience the things that we so long for in our heart, but it requires honesty.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's so good. One of the best, I think, books, people, resources that we always point to here at North Point is Brennan Manning. Mm-hmm. And he wrote a book called Ragamuffin Gospel. And I think so often, both if, for a Christian or not a Christian, I think we just try to do our way to God. So we try to hold it all together, stack up our good works. And when we do that, we're not being honest because we are relating to God out of our performance, right? Mm-hmm. And Brandon Manning says when we do that, he says our doing becomes the very undoing of the gospel, like the very purpose as to why Jesus came for us. And I think that so often that's why we can't be honest, is we're trying to stack up our good works to get to God. You know what I mean? And you talked about that. That's why you said Jesus is a friend of sinners. Jesus is a friend to me.
Yeah.
Because I'm a sinner. And it doesn't matter how long you've been a Christian. Jesus is a friend to sinners. He's a friend to me. And that's something we have to hold on to and remind ourselves of each and every day. Mm-hmm.
And one of the slippery slopes in Christianity and in religion in general is the more that you decide, okay, I'm going to move forward and I'm going to do these like, these disciplines, if you will, these religious disciplines. So I'm going to read the Bible. I'm going to start praying. I'm going to be honest. It's cool because you begin to experience Jesus on a new level. And now you go from chapter 1 to chapter 2 to chapter 3. The slippery slope with going through these chapters is self-righteousness. The slippery slope is the information now produces you to be puffed up. Mm-hmm. It now, you kind of lose sight that I am a sinner sitting around the table, as I alluded to on Sundays, with prostitutes and pastors, and we're all at the table of sinners. You lose sight of that. And I think we lose sight of that to the degree then to begin to go, oh, look at that sinner, I'm better than them. And, that's a slippery slope that I think our eyes need to be wide open to as we experience these really cool experiences with God, like when he gives us rest. And it's a peace that transcends all understanding. And that means, like, you can't quite understand and quantify how God met me, but I was honest and he did meet me. And I can just begin to describe my personal experience and my personal story, but he met me. Well, the more times that I experience that in my life, the danger or slippery slope is the more, you feel like, man, God is with me. I'm beginning to discover things and see things about Jesus. And now that information can puff us up to a place to be self-righteous. And I think it's always important. Like I said on Sunday, man, I go first. I think about my thoughts and, my attitude. And, I even shared an example, like, the night before I knew I was going to say this message, I just lost my patience with my boys. And I'm like, I'm in such need of Jesus' grace. I sit at the table of sinners. I am right there squarely at that table. And I think that's a great posture to be in.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a little Pharisee in all of us, right? And I think the more, even the more we lean into church stuff, the more we, serve and give, and obviously all those things are great and they grow us in our faith. But when we base our faith on those things, we begin to become the Pharisee. We begin to become, I'm going to base my relationship with God based on how well I'm performing for Him, and not on His grace. And we have to get honest again in those moments. We have to go, no, I need His grace more than anything.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Buck, that's really good. Well, as we think about, to wrap up the podcast, one last question.
Sure.
As we are going to go through this series, we're going to keep unpacking how we can focus on nothing else but Jesus in 2021 and the difference that can make. What do you think can happen in our community, in our world, the crazy world we live in, as a result of focusing on Jesus more in 2021?
Well, I would start with a big statement. And the big statement, I think the world can change. I absolutely do. I fundamentally believe that the world changed before, it can change again. And good Lord, I mean, think about the chaos with the Roman oppressive government. Think about the chaos in the world 2,000 years ago. And all the things that were set up against Christianity. It couldn't work. There's no way this could ever survive the first century. I mean, this little, sect, this little, cult, some people would say, of this Jewish carpenter, coming with this radical kind of love. But it transcended. It changed the world. I think it can do it again. So I would start with that. And then I would say part of the reason I would say that is because it can change the world. But I think the reason I'm so excited about this series, it starts with you. It changes you. It's your way forward. And I think all of a sudden you begin to see you for who you really are. You look in the mirror and you see Jesus' reflection on you. And you begin to see yourself of worth. You begin to see yourself of value. You begin to see yourself loved unconditionally. You see yourself as forgiven, and you're unshackled from the past choices that you have made. You see yourself as redeemed. You see yourself as purchased. You see yourself as having a life of meaning and purpose. And I think the more you can see you through the reflection of Jesus Christ, I think it brings this security, and it brings enough security for you to begin to start, risking love, risking what Jesus did for you. And now all of a sudden you're going, as we alluded to earlier, this person I completely disagree with politically. This person I completely disagree with on their position about whatever. But I'm curious. Jesus was so curious always. He was curious with Zacchaeus, what I shared on Sunday. And, and I'm curious, like, tell me more about you. Hey, I know I disagree, but I don't have to defend right now. I don't have to sit here and be like, tell you all my ideas. I don't have to talk really fast and talk over you. I don't have to even be defensive. You can accuse me of all kinds of things. That's fine. I'm just curious about you, though. Hey, tell me why you would say that. What do you see in me? That kind of position. And all of a sudden, what you discover as you work that process out is unconditional love, radical kind of love. And I do think that begins to change us from the ground up, not from the top down, but from the ground up, as it starts with your neighbor, or it starts with your family, it starts with your neighbor, it starts with your community, it starts with a city, it starts with a state, goes to the country, goes to the world. And it happened in the first century, where there was a world full of confusion, full of political persuasions, full of all this brokenness, all these injustices. But there was a group of people who were willing to look at the mirror and see the reflection of Jesus Christ on their life and see themselves with such value and worth and significance, and know that this is not their home. The world is not their home. Their home is the world to come, called eternity, called heaven. And it empowered them to go love radically, and it changed the world. And I think that can happen again. I really do, but it absolutely starts with focusing on nothing else but Jesus. So I think the world can change.
Yeah. Well, that was a great way to wrap up the podcast, and I'm super excited to continue to focus and think more about Jesus in 2021. We're going to be jumping into Nothing Else Part 2 this Sunday, so make sure to tune in. We'll be streaming live and in person, and then we'll be back here for Overtime a week from today. So anyways, thanks, Buck.
Awesome. Thank you, man.